Book 3, Chapter 107, continuing with verse 30. Then my wife and I began to quarrel in this dreadful forest. We kept shouting at each other with our clattering teeth and eyes ruddy from the cold. My foul and dirty body resembled that of a dark black demon. We roved around about the borders of rivers and brooks to fish with a rod and hook in my hand. I also wandered with a trap in my hand, like Yama with his noose at the desolation of the earth, and caught and killed and drank the heart blood of a deer in my hunger and thirst. I sucked the warm heart blood like milk from my mother's breast. Smeared in blood, I stood like a blood-sucking demon in the cemetery. The Vitala ghosts of the woods fled before me as they do from the furies of the forest. I set my snares and nets in the woods for catching deer and birds of the air. As people spread the nets of their wives and children, only to be entangled in them, in the false hope of happiness, so did I spread my net of thread to beguile the birds to their destruction. Though worried and worn out in the nets of worldly cares, I surrounded on every side by the miseries of our vicious lives. Yet our minds still take delight in cruel and foul acts to the injuries of others. Our wishes are stretched far and wide as a running river flows its banks in the rainy season. But the objects of our desires fly far away from us, like snakes, through their own wisdom, hide themselves from the snake-eating weasel. We have cast kindness off from our hearts, like the snake leaves off his skin, and take delight letting the hissing arrows of our malice fly, like a thunderstorm falls on all animals. Men delight at the sight of cooling clouds at the end of the hot season, but they avoid at a distance the rough, briny shores spreading wide before them. I underwent many difficulties, and that multiplied as quickly upon me as weeds growing in the valleys. During my destined time, I moved about all corners of that hellish spot. I have sown the seeds of sin under the rainwater of my ignorance to grow speedily as thorns on my way. I have laid hidden snares for the unwary innocent to bind myself in the mountain cave. I have caught and killed innocent deer in traps to feed upon its flesh. I have killed the fly-whisk cow to lay my head on the hair hanging down their necks. I slept unconscious of myself in my ignorance. As Vishnu lay on his huge hydra, I laid with my outstretched legs and limbs in the brown cell, resounding to the yell of wild beasts. Outside. I also laid my body on the frost of a cave in the marshy Grand of Vindhya and wrapped my swarthy form in a tattered twill full of fleas and hanging down my neck. I bore it on my back as a bear carries the long bristles upon him, even in the hot season. I suffered the heat of wildfires that burned many animals that perished in groups, like in the last conflagration of the world. My wife bore her young ones, both for our pleasure as well as pain, like a glutton's food serves both his gratification and sickness, and like the influence of planets is for our good and evil. Thus I, the only son of a king, had to pass 60 painful years of my life as so many kalpa ages of the long duration. I raved sometimes in my rage and wept at others in my bitter grief. I lived on coarse meals and dwelt, alas, in the house of vulgar trifle. Thus I passed so many years of my misery in that place, as one fastened to the chains of his insatiable desires is doomed to toil and moil for nothing until his death. King Lavana's description of drought and wildfire, chapter 108. The king continued to say, time passed away, old age overtook me, and turned my beard to blades of grass covered with white frost. My days passed away in alternate joy and grief, brought on my fate and acts, just like a river flows with green and dried leaves scattered on it by the wind. Every moment I suffered quarrels and arguments and misfortunes and bad luck. They beset me as thick and as fast as the arrows of sorrow flying in battle. My foolish mind kept fluttering like a bird in the maze of my wishes and fancies. My heart was disturbed by passions, like the sea by its raging waves. My soul was revolving on the vehicle of my wandering thoughts. I was carried away by them like floating straw to the whirlpool of the eventful ocean of time. I, who moved about like a worm in the woodlands of India for my simple support, felt in the passing years to be weaker and pulled down in my frame like a two-legged beast of burden. In that state of my wretchedness, I forgot my royalty like a dead man and became convinced that I was a tribal bound to that hilly spot like a wingless bird. The world appeared to me like the final desolation, a forest consumed by fire. It seemed like the seashore lashed by huge waves, or a withered tree struck by lightning. The marshy ground at the foot of India was all dried up and left no grain, vegetable, or water, or food or drink. The whole group of tribals was about to die in dearth and dryness. Clouds ceased to rain and disappeared from sight. Winds blew with sparks of fire, and forest trees were bare and leafless, and withered leaves were strewn over the ground. Wildfires were raging here and there, and the woodlands became as desolate as the homes of austere ascetics. There followed a severe famine, and a furious wildfire spread all around. It burnt down the whole forest and reduced grass and gravel to ashes. People had ash all over their bodies and were starving for want of food and drink. The land was without any article of food, or even grass or water. It had turned into a dreary desert. The mirage of the desert glistened like water, and deluded dry buffaloes to roll in. There was no current of breeze to cool the desert air. Only calls and cries for water came to the ears of men who were parched under the burning rays of the torrid sun. The hungry mob, hurrying to browse upon branches and herbs, yielded their lives in those acts, while others sharpened their teeth, tearing and devouring one another. Some ran to bite the gum of Kachetu, thinking it was a bit of flesh. Others swallowed stones, as if they were lying on the ground before them. The ground was sprinkled with blood from men biting and tearing each other, like blood profusely spilled when a lion kills a big and starving elephant. Everyone was as ferocious as a lion in his attempt to devour another as his prey. Men fought each other like wrestlers in a contest. Trees were leafless, and hot winds blew like firebrands on all sides. Wild cats licked human blood spilled on the rocky ground. The wild flames rose high in the air with clouds of smoke whirling with the howling winds of the forest. It growled aloud everywhere and filled the forest land with heaps of brown cinders and burning firebrands. Huge serpents were burned in their caves, and the fumes arising from their burning bodies served to grow poisonous plants, while the flame, stretching aloft with the winds, gave the sky an appearance of the glory of the setting sun. Strong howling winds raised heaps of ashes like dust that stood like domes in the sky, unsupported by pillars. Little children stood by their weeping parents, crying for fear of them. There were some men who tore a dead body with their teeth, and in their great haste to devour the flesh, bit their own hands and fingers that were covered with their own blood. Vultures flying in the air darted upon the smoke, thinking it a turret of trees, and pounced upon the firebrands, taking them for bits of raw flesh. Men biting and tearing one another were flying in all directions when the splitting of burning wood hit their breasts and bellies and made them gory with blood gushing out of them. Winds were howling in hollow caves, and the flames of the wildfire flashed with fury. Snakes were hissing for fear of these, and the burned woods were falling down with hideous noise. Thus, beset by dangers and horrors, with no shelter other than the rugged hollows of rocks, this place presented a picture of this world with its encompassing flames, burning like the 12 zodiacal suns on high. Winds blowing hot in the burning woods and drops dried up everything. The heat of the fire below and the sun above, together with the domestic disaster caused by the influence of the planet Saturn, made this place a counterpart of this sorrowful world. Chapter 109. migration of the tribal. Mine creates it all. The king continued. As the displeasure of destiny continued, these disasters to rage in this place, prematurely overtaking the forest and people with the last disasters of the last dissolution. Some of these men with their wives and children went out from that place in search of some new place to live in foreign lands. Like clouds disperse and disappear from the sky after the rainy season is over. Wives, children, and close relatives accompanied them, clinging like the members of their body, but the lean and infirm were left behind like branches broken from trees. Some of these immigrants were devoured by tigers as they went out of their houses, like hatchling birds are caught by falcons as they come out of their nest. Some entered into the fire like moths to put an end to their miserable lot. Others fell into pits like fragments of rock falling from the hill. I separated from the connections of my father-in-law and others, and depending upon myself, I escaped narrowly from that distressed country with my wife and children. We passed pitfalls, storms, wild beasts and snakes without any harm. We came out of that forest safe from all the deadly perils along the way. Arriving at the edge of that forest, we got under the shade of some palm tree, where I let my children down from my shoulders as burdens of my sin and sorrow. I halted there after my tiring journey and lengthened trouble, like one who had fled from the confines of hell. I took my rest like the withering lotus from the scorching sunbeams and heat of summer. My tribal wife also slept under the same tree, and my two children lay fast asleep in each other's embrace under the cooling shade. Afterwards, my younger son, Rachakra, who was as dear to us as he was the less intelligent, rose up and stood before me. He said with a depressed spirit and tears gushing out of his eyes, "Father, give me some meat, food, and drink, or else I die." The little boy repeatedly made the same request, saying with tears in his eyes that he was dying of hunger. I told him that I had no meat, and the more I said no, the more he repeated his foolish craving, which could neither be supplied with nor put down to silence. I was then moved by paternal affection and affliction of my heart to tell him, "Child, cut off a slice of my flesh and roast and eat it." He agreed to it and said, "Give it then." His hunger was so pressing and his vitality was so exhausted that he could not decide to crave my flesh for his food. But then, overpowered by affection and compassion, I thought to put an end to my grief with my life, which became so intolerable to me in this extreme distress. Being unable to endure the pain of my affection, I despaired of my own life and resolved to resort to death as my only friend in this last extreme. I collected some wood and heaped them together for my funeral pile. Having put it on fire, I saw it was blazing as I wished. As I was hurrying to throw myself on this burning pile, I was suddenly roused from my reverie by the sound of music proceeding from this palace, hailing me as king and shouting Jaya for my victory. I understood this conjurer had wrought this enchantment on me and put all these imaginable troubles for so long a period. Like the ignorant, I was subject to 100 changes of fortune. Vasishtha speaking, as the great and mighty King Lavana was describing his fluctuations of fortune, the sorcerer suddenly disappeared from sight. The courtiers looked around with staring eyes, then addressed the king, saying, "Our loyal lord, this man was no sorcerer with his own mercenary views. It was divine magic shown to our Lord to demonstrate the lot of humanity and the state of the world. Evidently, this world is a creation of the mind, and the imaginary world is only a display of the infinite power of the Almighty. These hundreds of worldly systems display the various powers of omnipotence that delude even the minds of the most wise to believe in the reality of unreality, as it were by the spell of magic. This delusion being so powerful on the minds of wise, it is no wonder that our king could be overpowered when all the common minds were laboring under the same error. This delusive magic was not spread over the mind by any trick or art of a conjurer who wanted nothing more than his own gain. They who love money never go away by themselves. Without getting something. Therefore, we are tossed on the waves of doubt to take him for his sorcerer. Vashishta said, Ram, though I am sitting here at this moment before you and others of this assembly, yet I am quite aware of the truth of this story. It is no fiction, like the tale for the boy that I told you before. Nor is it any invention or hearsay of mine. Thus the mind is enlarged by the various inventions of its imagination, just as a tree is extended by the expansion of its boughs and branches. The extended mind encompasses all things, like an outstretched tree spreads over the ground. The mind's comprehension of everything and its familiarity with the nature of all things serve to lead it to its state of perfection. Chapter 110. Description of the mind's play. Vashishta said, in the beginning, the subjective consciousness, Chit, derived from the power of knowing objective phenomena, Chaitya, from the supreme cause. Then it went on to multiply and diversify the objects of its intelligence, and thus fell from the knowledge of the one intelligent universal ego to the delusion of the particular non-egos without end. Thus, Rama, the faculties of the mind, being deluded by the unreal of particular, and to their utter error, continued to attribute specialty and differences to the general one. Mental powers are ever busy, multiplying unrealities to infinite, just as ignorant children are prone to create false demons of their fancy only for their terror and trouble. But reality soon disperses troublesome unrealities, and unsullied understanding drives off the errors of imagination as sunshine dispels the dark. The mind brings distant objects near it and throws the nearer ones at a distance. It trots and flutters in living beings, like children leaping and jumping in bushes after little birds. The wistful mind is fearful when there is nothing to fear. Like a frightened traveler takes the stump of a tree for a demon standing on his way. The suspicious mind suspects a friend or a foe. Like a drunken sot, thinks himself lying on the ground while he is walking along. The distracted mind sees fiery Saturn in the cooling moon, and nectar, being swallowed as poison, acts as poison itself. The building of a castle in the air, however untrue, is taken for truth for the time being. The mind dwelling on hopes is a dreamer in its waking state. Disease of desire is the delusion of the mind. Therefore, it is to be rooted out from the mind at once and with all diligence. The minds of men are entangled in the net of greed. Like poor stags, they are rendered as helpless as beasts of prey in the forest of the world. He who by his reasoning has removed the vain anxieties of his mind has displayed the light of his soul, like that of the unclouded sun to sight. Therefore know that the mind makes the man and not his body, as some think. The body is dull matter, but the mind is neither material nor immaterial substance. Whatever is done with the mind by any man, know, Rama, that act is actually done by him. Whoever is shunned by the mind, know that it is kept out in actuality. The mind alone makes the whole world to the utmost end of the spheres. The mind is the emptiness and the air and earth in its greatness. If the mind does not join a thing with its known properties and qualities, then the sun, planets, and stars would appear to be without their light. The mind assumes the properties of knowledge and ignorance, from which it is called a knowing or unknowing thing. But these properties are not to be attributed to the body, for a living body is never known to be wise, or a dead carcass, an ignorant person. The mind becomes sight in its act of seeing, and hearing when it hears anything. It is feeling when the skin touches anything. And smelling when something touches the nose. It becomes taste, connected with the tongue and palate, and takes many other names besides, according to its other faculties. Thus, the mind is the chief actor on the stage of the living animal body. It magnifies the minute and makes the true appear as untrue. It sweetens the bitter and sours the sweet, and turns a foe to a friend and vice versa. In whatever manner the mind represents itself in its various aspects, the same becomes evident to us both in our perceptions and conceptions of them. So what we've been observing here in this reading is the illusion created solely by the mind. And the mind is creating and seeing and touching and distinguishing, driven by the accumulation of karmic traces. The mind continues the accumulation of more karmic traces by acting out of ignorance and in opposition to the divine karmic traces. And like a snowball at the top of a snow-covered mountain, it rolls down the mountain, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. At the beginning, there is only one tiny mistake. The mind forms like a bubble in consciousness. It has no real existence. But like a bubble in an ocean, it appears to exist temporarily. And because it is made of consciousness, it has only one objective. And that objective is to know itself. And as soon as it forms that objective of knowing itself, it has created separation. And it is that separation from the wholeness that starts the whole process. This is the initial mistake. This is pragya prag. This is the final karmic trace that we must all balance. It is upon balancing this final karmic trace that we arrive at the end of moksha level 5. To get to that final karmic trace, hidden under mountain ranges of karmic traces, is our objective. So the whole process is reduced to something quite simple. We must balance karmic traces. Fortunately, by the nature of karmic traces, we only have to poke a hole or burrow a tunnel in the mountain ranges of karmic traces to begin to see the light that is always there on the other side. And then using that strategy of burrowing tunnels in the karmic traces, we can undermine the whole structure and eventually collapse it.